The shadows of history are filled with names that most people have never heard, yet their crimes were so horrific, so calculated, and so evil that they deserve to be remembered not for glorification, but as stark reminders of the depths of human depravity. Today we're diving into the twisted minds and brutal acts of 5 serial killers whose stories have been overshadowed by more famous cases, but whose evil rivals or even surpasses the most notorious murderers in history. These aren't your typical serial killer stories. These are the monsters who slipped through the cracks of public memory, whose crimes were so disturbing that society almost seems to have collectively chosen to forget them. But forgetting evil doesn't make it disappear. It only ensures that we remain unprepared for when it shows its face again. What makes a person truly evil? Is it the number of victims, the brutality of the methods, or is it something deeper, something that transforms a human being into a predator, so calculating, so remorseless that they cease to be recognizable as human at all? The 5 killers we're about to explore each represent the different face of evil, from the cunning Black Widow who turned murder into a business, to the sadistic torturer who documented his crimes for posterity. Belle Gunness stands as perhaps the most successful female serial killer in American history, a woman who turned the promise of love into a death sentence for dozens of unsuspecting men. Her story begins not in the heartland of America, where she would claim so many lives, but in the harsh fjords of Norway, where Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturseth was born on November 11th, 1859, in the small village of Selbu. The woman who would become known as Belle Gunness arrived in America in 1881, part of the great wave of Scandinavian immigration that brought millions to the promised land. She settled initially in Chicago, that bustling metropolis where fortunes were made and lost, where a person could reinvent themselves completely. And reinvent herself she did, though not in the way most immigrants dreamed of. Belle's transformation from immigrant to monster began with her first marriage to Mads Albert Sorensen in 1884. They opened a confectionery shop together, a sweet beginning that would turn bitter with shocking speed. The shop burned down within a year, conveniently insured, and Belle collected the insurance money. This would become a pattern, a signature that would mark her entire criminal career. But it was the death of Mads himself that truly revealed Belle's true nature. On July 30th, 1900, Mads died suddenly and mysteriously. The timing was impeccable from Belle's perspective. He died on the one day when his 2 separate life insurance policies overlapped, ensuring that Belle would collect the maximum payout. His family was suspicious, whispering that Belle had poisoned him, but no charges were ever filed. Belle collected the insurance money and began planning her next move. Her second marriage to Peter Gunness in 1902 was even more short-lived and tragic. Peter had an infant daughter from his previous marriage, and within a week of Belle moving into his home, the child was dead. Belle claimed the baby had died in an accident, but the pattern was becoming clear to anyone paying attention. 8 months later, Peter himself was dead, killed by what Belle claimed was a falling sausage grinder that struck him in the head. The coroner ruled it an accident, but Peter's family knew better. They knew Belle had murdered him, but proving it was another matter entirely. With Peter's death and the insurance money in her pocket, Belle made her most calculated move yet. She purchased a 48-acre farm in LaPorte, Indiana, a isolated property where she could operate without the prying eyes of neighbors. It was here that Belle Gunness would perfect her system of murder, creating what can only be described as a killing machine disguised as a lonely hearts operation. Belle's method was as brilliant as it was evil. She placed advertisements in Norwegian American newspapers across the Midwest, presenting herself as a comely widow seeking companionship and marriage. These weren't random advertisements. Belle specifically targeted Norwegian language publications because she knew her fellow immigrants would be more trusting, more likely to believe her promises of love and domestic bliss. The advertisements were masterpieces of manipulation. Belle would describe herself as a successful farmer with property and money, seeking a good man to share her life. But here was the crucial hook. She would suggest that her ideal suitor should be a man of means, someone who could bring his own resources to their union. She encouraged potential suitors to liquidate their assets, to bring their life savings with them when they came to meet her. The men who responded to these advertisements had no idea they were signing their own death warrants. They would arrive at Belle's farm with their worldly possessions, their savings, sometimes even their livestock and farm equipment, ready to start a new life with the woman they believed would be their bride. Instead, they found death. Belle's killing method was as efficient as it was brutal. She would typically serve her victims coffee laced with strychnine, a poison that would incapacitate them quickly. Once they were helpless, she would finish them off with an axe or a cleaver, showing no more emotion than a farmer slaughtering livestock. And in Belle's mind, that's exactly what these men were, livestock to be harvested for their wealth. The disposal of the bodies showed Belle's practical nature and complete lack of human empathy. She would dismember the corpses, burying parts around her property, feeding others to her hogs. The pigs would consume the evidence, leaving behind only bones that Belle would scatter or bury in unmarked graves. It was a system so efficient that many of her victims simply vanished without a trace, their families never knowing what had happened to their loved ones. But Belle's evil extended beyond just the men she lured to her farm. She adopted children, presenting herself as a caring mother figure, only to kill them when they became inconvenient or when their insurance policies matured. Her adopted daughter, Jenny, disappeared in 1906, with Belle claiming the girl had gone to a finishing school in California. In reality, Jenny's body was buried on the farm, another victim of Belle's insatiable greed. The scope of Belle's crimes is staggering. Conservative estimates put her victim count at least 12 confirmed murders, but many investigators believe the true number could be as high as 40 or even more. She operated her murder farm for nearly a decade, perfecting her system, growing bolder with each successful kill. What makes Belle Gunness particularly terrifying is not just the number of her victims, but the calculated nature of her crimes. This wasn't a person who killed in a moment of passion or rage. Belle was a businesswoman who had turned murder into a profitable enterprise. She kept detailed records of her correspondence with potential victims, planned their deaths meticulously, and disposed of their bodies with industrial efficiency. The end of Belle's killing spree came not through brilliant detective work, but through the suspicions of one man who got too close to the truth. Ray Lamphere was a handyman who worked on Belle's farm and had become infatuated with her. When Belle began courting another victim, Andrew Helglian, Lamphere became jealous and began making threats. Belle fired him, but Lamphere knew too much about her operations to simply walk away. On April 28, 1908, Belle's farmhouse burned to the ground in a massive fire. When investigators sifted through the ruins, they found the bodies of Belle's 3 foster children and what appeared to be Belle herself, though the adult female body was headless and significantly smaller than Belle's known stature. The discovery of the children's bodies was heartbreaking enough, but what investigators found next would shock the nation. As they began searching the property more thoroughly, investigators uncovered a charnel house that defied belief. Body after body was unearthed from around the farm. Dismembered remains were found in the pig pen, in the garden, in shallow graves scattered across the property. The bodies were in various states of decomposition, some reduced to mere bones, others still bearing the marks of Belle's brutal handiwork. The investigation revealed the full scope of Belle's correspondence with potential victims. Letters were found from dozens of men, many of whom had already arrived at the farm and disappeared. Bank records showed deposits of money and valuables that corresponded with the arrival dates of missing persons. It was a paper trail that painted a clear picture of Belle's systematic approach to murder. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. As investigators continued their work, they realized that the headless body found in the house was not Belle Gunness at all. The body was too small, too slight to be the robust woman who had terrorized the Midwest for nearly a decade. Belle had staged her own death using the body of another victim as a decoy and had vanished into the night. The mystery of Belle Gunness's ultimate fate has persisted for over a century. Some believe she died in the fire after all, that the body was indeed hers despite the size discrepancy. Others are convinced that she escaped, that she assumed a new identity and continued her killing elsewhere. There have been numerous reported sightings over the years, women who matched Belle's description operating similar schemes in different parts of the country. What cannot be disputed is the legacy of evil that Belle Gunness left behind. She demonstrated that monsters don't always look like monsters, that evil can wear the mask of respectability, even maternal care. Her ability to manipulate and deceive, to present herself as a loving woman while planning the deaths of those who trusted her, represents a form of evil that is particularly chilling because it is so human. The case of Belle Gunness also highlights the vulnerabilities of immigrants and isolated individuals in early 20th century America. Her victims were often men who had few connections, who had left their families behind in search of a better life. Their disappearances were easily explained away, their deaths unnoticed by a society that didn't always value the lives of newcomers and outcasts. In the end, Belle Gunness may have been the most successful serial killer in American history, not just in terms of victim count, but in her ability to evade justice. Whether she died in that fire in 1908 or lived out her days under an assumed name, she had achieved what so many criminals only dream of. She had gotten away with it. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is what makes her story so deeply disturbing. The farm in La Porte became a macabre tourist attraction, with thousands of people visiting to gawk at the site where so many had died. Souvenirs were sold, pictures were taken, and the memory of the victims was overshadowed by the morbid fascination with their killer. Moving from the nightmare of Belle Gunness's murder farm to the grimy streets of 1970s New York, we encounter another monster who perfected the art of appearing utterly ordinary while harboring unspeakable evil. His name was Richard Cottingham, and for over a decade he lived two completely separate lives. By day, he was a mild-mannered computer operator for Blue Cross Blue Shield, a married father of three living in suburban New Jersey. By night, he prowled the seedy underbelly of Times Square and the highways of New York and New Jersey, hunting for victims to satisfy his twisted need for control and brutality. What made Cottingham particularly terrifying wasn't just his savagery, but his ability to compartmentalize his evil so completely that no one suspected the quiet family man was capable of such horrors. He earned the chilling nickname, the Torso Killer, for his habit of dismembering victims, often leaving behind only torsos while disposing of heads and hands to prevent identification. Between 1967 and 1980, this seemingly respectable suburban father would become one of America's most prolific serial killers, officially convicted of 18 murders, but claiming to have killed between 85 and 100 people. Cottingham's descent into murder began in the late 1960s, though his earliest confirmed kills wouldn't be discovered for decades. His initial victims were heartbreakingly innocent, young women and teenage girls who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nancy Vogel was just 29 when she vanished after leaving her job at a Ridgefield Park, New Jersey insurance company in October 1967. Her body was found 2 weeks later in her car, strangled with her own bra. Diane Cusick, an 18-year-old high school student, was abducted from a shopping mall in New Jersey in February 1968. She was found beaten, raped, and strangled in the back seat of her car. These early murders established a pattern that would define Cottingham's methodology for years to come. He was methodical, patient, and extraordinarily careful about covering his tracks. Unlike killers who acted in frenzied rage, Cottingham approached murder like a calculated project. He studied his victims, learned their routines, and struck when they were most vulnerable. His background in computers gave him an analytical mind that he applied to his crimes with chilling efficiency. As the years progressed, Cottingham's killing evolved and intensified. He began targeting different types of victims, shifting from random encounters to more deliberate hunting grounds. The explosion of Times Square's sex trade in the 1970s provided him with a perfect hunting ground where vulnerable women disappeared regularly without much police attention. Prostitutes, runaways, and drug addicts became his preferred prey because their disappearances were less likely to trigger intensive investigations. His methods became increasingly brutal and sadistic. Cottingham didn't just kill, he tortured. He would rent rooms at cheap motels, particularly Quality Inn locations, where he would subject his victims to hours of unimaginable suffering before finally ending their lives. He used ligatures to strangle them, beat them with blunt objects, and in some cases mutilated them while they were still alive. The psychological torture was as important to him as the physical violence. He wanted his victims to know they were going to die, to feel completely helpless and terrified. The most shocking example of his depravity occurred in December 1979 at the Travel Inn Motor Hotel in Times Square. Firefighters responding to a fire alarm discovered a scene that would haunt them forever. In room 417, they found two headless, handless female torsos on the beds, both set ablaze. The victims had been decapitated and their hands removed to prevent identification. The room had been doused with lighter fluid and set on fire, but the flames had gone out before completely destroying the evidence. This crime scene perfectly encapsulated Cottingham's signature methods. The removal of heads and hands wasn't just about preventing identification, it was about reducing his victims to anonymous objects, stripping away their humanity entirely. The fire was meant to destroy DNA evidence and any traces that could lead back to him. Every aspect was calculated to ensure he could continue killing without detection. What made Cottingham particularly dangerous was his ability to learn and adapt. Each murder taught him something new about avoiding capture. He varied his methods, changed his hunting grounds, and constantly refined his techniques for disposing of evidence. He kept detailed mental notes about what worked and what didn't, approaching serial murder with the same systematic thinking he applied to his computer programming job. His double life was maintained through careful compartmentalization. At home in Lodi, New Jersey, he was Richard the devoted husband and father, helping with homework and attending school events. His wife and children had no idea that the man who kissed them goodnight was spending his free time torturing and murdering women. Co-workers described him as quiet, competent, and unremarkable. He never missed work after a murder, never showed signs of stress or guilt, never aroused suspicion. This facade began to crack as his crimes escalated in frequency and brutality. By 1980, Cottingham was killing more regularly and taking greater risks. His need for violence was consuming more of his mental energy, making it harder to maintain his normal appearance. He began making mistakes, leaving behind more evidence, and choosing victims who were more likely to be missed. His downfall came on May 22, 1980, when he made a critical error in judgment. At a Quality Inn in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, he had lured an 18-year-old prostitute named Leslie Odell to his room. Following his usual pattern, he bound and tortured her, but this time something went wrong. Odell fought back harder than his previous victims, and her screams attracted attention from other guests. When police arrived, they found Cottingham fleeing the scene, leaving behind a victim who was barely alive, but able to identify him. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Cottingham's crimes. His car contained a veritable torture kit: handcuffs, knives, rope, pills, and other instruments of violence. His home yielded more evidence, including items belonging to victims and detailed records that helped investigators connect him to unsolved murders dating back over a decade. Most chilling was the discovery of a collection of personal items taken from victims, trophies that he kept to relive his crimes. During interrogation, Cottingham displayed the same cold calculation that had characterized his murders. He was cooperative when it served his interests, evasive when pressed for details, and showed no genuine remorse for his actions. He spoke about his crimes in clinical terms, describing the logistics of murder and disposal as if discussing a technical problem at work. When asked about his motivations, he claimed his biggest thrill was the challenge of killing in various ways while avoiding detection. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy. Cottingham was tried in multiple jurisdictions for different murders, with prosecutors carefully selecting cases where they had the strongest evidence. He was convicted of murder in both New York and New Jersey, receiving multiple life sentences that ensured he would never be released. The trials revealed disturbing details about his methods and mindset, painting a picture of a predator who viewed human life as meaningless. Even after his conviction, Cottingham's story continued to unfold. Cold case detectives, particularly Detective Robert Anzalotti of the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, spent years building relationships with Cottingham in prison, slowly extracting confessions to decades-old unsolved murders. These conversations, described as elaborate cat and mouse games, resulted in Cottingham admitting to additional killings and providing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. In 2021, nearly 40 years after his initial conviction, Cottingham pleaded guilty to the 1974 murders of two teenage girls, Mary Ann Pryor and Lorraine Kelly. The girls, both 17, had been abducted from a shopping mall in North Bergen, New Jersey, while looking for jobs. Their bodies were found 5 days later in a wooded area, showing signs of torture and sexual assault. Cottingham's confession finally solved a case that had haunted investigators and the victims' families for nearly half a century. The full extent of Richard Cottingham's crimes may never be known. His claims of killing up to 100 people span multiple states and decades, with many potential victims never reported missing or their cases never connected to him. DNA technology has helped link him to additional murders, but the passage of time and his methodical destruction of evidence have made proving many cases impossible. Today, Richard Cottingham remains imprisoned in New Jersey, serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. At 77 years old, he continues to occasionally provide information about unsolved cases, though investigators must carefully verify any claims he makes. His cooperation seems motivated less by genuine remorse than by a desire for attention and control, even from behind bars. The case of Richard Cottingham represents one of the most chilling examples of how evil can hide behind a mask of normalcy. For over a decade, he successfully maintained the appearance of a typical suburban family man while secretly orchestrating a campaign of torture and murder that claimed dozens of lives. His story serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who blend seamlessly into society, using their ordinary appearance as camouflage while they hunt for victims. His ability to compartmentalize his crimes so completely that even his own family never suspected speaks to a level of psychological manipulation that extends far beyond his victims. The wives, children, co-workers, and neighbors who knew Richard Cottingham, the computer programmer, had no idea they were living alongside Richard Cottingham, the serial killer. This dual existence allowed him to continue killing for years longer than he might have otherwise, claiming more victims and causing immeasurable suffering to countless families. The investigation and prosecution of Cottingham also highlighted important developments in criminal investigation techniques. His case was among the early examples of how DNA evidence could be used to solve cold cases decades after the crimes occurred. While Belle Gunness and Richard Cottingham masked their evil behind ordinary facades, our third case takes us into a different realm of horror entirely. Manuel Moore wasn't hiding his intentions behind fake love letters or suburban respectability. He was part of something far more sinister, something that would terrorize an entire city and expose the darkest corners of racial hatred in America. In the early 1970s, San Francisco was a city transforming itself. The Summer of Love was a fading memory, but the cultural revolution it sparked was still reshaping the social landscape. Against this backdrop of change and tension, a group of men began meeting in secret. They called themselves the Death Angels, and their mission was simple yet horrifying: kill as many white people as possible to ignite a race war that would cleanse America. Manuel Moore was born into poverty in Louisiana in 1946, the son of sharecroppers who barely scraped by in the segregated South. His childhood was marked by the brutal realities of Jim Crow, where humiliation and violence were daily reminders of his place in society's hierarchy. By the time he reached his teens, Moore had developed a burning resentment that would only grow stronger with each passing year. He moved to California in the late 1960s, seeking opportunities that didn't exist in the rural South, but what he found instead was a different kind of discrimination, more subtle perhaps, but no less damaging to his already fractured psyche. It was in Oakland that Moore first encountered the Nation of Islam, specifically a radical splinter faction that preached not just black separatism, but active warfare against white society. The group's leader, a charismatic man who went by various names, taught that killing white people was not just justified but necessary for the salvation of the black race. Each kill, he claimed, would earn the perpetrator wings in the afterlife. The more brutal the murder, the higher one's status in this twisted hierarchy of hatred. Moore wasn't alone in his indoctrination. C. Simon, a man whose quiet demeanor masked a capacity for unspeakable cruelty. Together, they formed the core of what would become known as the Zebra Killers, named after the police radio channel used to coordinate the massive investigation that would eventually bring them down. The killing began on October 19, 1973, with an attack that established the pattern of random, racially motivated violence that would define the Zebra murders. The victim was Richard Haig, a white man walking with his wife Linda near their apartment. The attackers approached from behind, hacking at Richard with a machete while simultaneously assaulting Linda. Richard survived, but barely, his face permanently disfigured by the brutal assault. Linda was kidnapped, raped, and murdered, her body left in a nearby park like discarded garbage. What made the Zebra murders particularly terrifying was their complete randomness. Victims were chosen solely for their race, plucked from San Francisco's streets without warning or provocation. On November 25, 1973, Salim Erekat, a Middle Eastern store clerk mistaken for white, was gunned down during what appeared to be a routine robbery, but left no money taken. A month later, Paul Danzig was shot and killed while walking home from work, his only crime being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The attacks escalated in both frequency and brutality as winter turned to spring. On December 11th, Arthur Agnos, a future mayor of San Francisco, was shot twice while walking to his car, but miraculously survived. 5 days later, Marietta DiGirolamo was brutally murdered in her apartment, the killer having gained entry through deception before unleashing unimaginable violence upon the defenseless woman. But it was the events of January 28, 1974, that truly showcased the depths of the Death Angels' depravity. 5 separate attacks occurred within a span of just a few hours, turning San Francisco into a war zone. Tana Smith was shot and killed while walking down the street. Vincent Wallen was gunned down at a bus stop. John Bambick was murdered while using a payphone. Ward Anderson was shot while cleaning his car. The randomness was complete, the terror absolute. Moore's role in these murders was both hands-on and organizational. He didn't just participate in the killings, he helped plan them, scouting locations and identifying potential victims. The Death Angels would cruise the city in stolen cars, hunting for isolated white individuals like predators stalking prey. Moore was particularly drawn to victims who appeared vulnerable, the elderly, women walking alone, men who looked like they couldn't fight back effectively. The psychological profile that emerged of Moore during the investigation revealed a man consumed by racial hatred, but also addicted to the power that came with taking life. Unlike serial killers motivated by sexual gratification or personal grudges, Moore killed for ideology, but the ideology provided cover for darker impulses. Witnesses who survived encounters with the group described Moore as calm during the attacks, almost businesslike in his approach to murder. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Anthony Harris, a former member of the Death Angels who had participated in some of the earlier murders, grew increasingly uncomfortable with the escalating violence. The group's bloodlust seemed insatiable, and Harris began to fear that their activities would eventually lead to his own death, either at the hands of police or from his fellow Death Angels who might view him as a liability. In April 1974, Harris approached the San Francisco Police Department with information that would crack the case wide open. He provided names, descriptions, vehicle information, and most importantly, detailed accounts of specific murders. His testimony revealed the systematic nature of the killings, the careful planning that went into each attack, and the twisted reward system that motivated the perpetrators. Harris described how the Death Angels would meet regularly to plan their next attacks, with Moore often taking a leadership role in selecting targets and escape routes. The group maintained detailed records of their kills, treating each murder like a business transaction. They even took photographs of some victims, creating a macabre trophy collection that they would review during their meetings. The investigation that followed Harris's revelations was massive, involving hundreds of officers and spanning multiple jurisdictions. Police discovered that the Death Angels had been active not just in San Francisco, but throughout the Bay Area and possibly in other states as well. The true scope of their killing spree may never be fully known, but estimates suggest they were responsible for as many as 73 murders over a 4-year period. Manuel Moore was arrested on May 1st, 1974, along with his co-conspirators. The evidence against them was overwhelming, built not just on Harris's testimony, but on physical evidence, witness identifications, and the killer's own careless mistakes. During interrogation, Moore showed no remorse for his actions, instead expressing regret that he hadn't killed more white people. He viewed himself as a soldier in a racial holy war, and the murders as acts of justified revenge for centuries of oppression. The trial that followed was a media sensation, drawing national attention to issues of race, religion, and violence in America. Moore's defense team attempted to argue that he had been brainwashed by the Radical Nation of Islam faction, but the prosecution successfully demonstrated that his actions were deliberate and calculated, not the product of mental illness or coercion. On March 29, 1976, Manuel Moore was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the era's reluctance to impose the death penalty. His co-conspirators received similar sentences, effectively ending the Death Angel's reign of terror. Moore spent the remainder of his life in California's prison system, where he continued to espouse the racial ideologies that had motivated his killing spree. He never expressed remorse for his victims, never acknowledged the pain he had caused to families and communities. In interviews conducted years after his conviction, Moore remained unrepentant, describing his murders as necessary acts in an ongoing racial conflict. The legacy of Manuel Moore and the zebra murders extends far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case highlighted the potential for racial hatred to manifest in extreme violence, serving as a precursor to later incidents of domestic terrorism motivated by racial ideology. It also demonstrated the challenges law enforcement faces when investigating crimes motivated by group ideology rather than individual pathology. Moore died in prison in 2017, having served over 4 decades behind bars. His death passed largely unnoticed by the media, a stark contrast to the terror he had once inspired. But for the families of his victims, for the survivors who still bear physical and emotional scars from their encounters with the Death Angels, his death provided only limited closure. The randomness of the zebra murders, the way they turned ordinary activities like walking to work or waiting for a bus into potentially fatal encounters, created a level of community trauma that persisted long after the killers were captured. San Francisco in 1973 and 1974 became a city where people looked over their shoulders, where racial tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface exploded into open fear and suspicion. What makes Manuel Moore's case particularly disturbing is how it reveals the potential for ideological hatred to transform ordinary individuals into instruments of terror. Moore wasn't born a killer. He was made into one through a toxic combination of personal resentment, social alienation, and exposure to extremist ideology. His story serves as a warning about the dangers of allowing racial hatred to fester unchecked and the devastating consequences when that hatred finds organizational structure and leadership. The Death Angels represented something different from the typical serial killer profile. They weren't lone wolves driven by personal demons, but rather a coordinated group motivated by shared ideology. This made them both more dangerous and ultimately more vulnerable to detection. Their need to share their experiences, to validate their actions within the group structure, created the very vulnerabilities that led to their downfall. Today, the zebra murders are studied by law enforcement agencies as an early example of domestic terrorism, a precursor to the organized hate crimes that would plague America in subsequent decades. In February of 2002, FBI agents descended on a modest brick house in Ferguson, Missouri, a quiet suburb of St. Louis. What they discovered inside would forever change how law enforcement tracked serial killers in the digital age. The basement had been converted into something that defied comprehension, a torture chamber equipped with restraints, recording equipment, and stains that told a story too horrific to fully grasp. The man who lived there, 40-year-old Maury Travis, had just made a fatal mistake that would expose one of the most disturbing killing sprees in American history. Maury Travis was born on October 25th, 1965, into what appeared to be an ordinary working-class family in St. Louis. His childhood offered few clear warning signs of the monster he would become. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, withdrawn, unremarkable. He struggled in school, drifted between jobs, and by his 20s had developed a serious drug problem that led to petty crimes. In 1989, he was convicted of armed robbery and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served 9 years before being released on parole in 1998, seemingly rehabilitated and ready to rejoin society. But prison hadn't reformed Maury Travis. Instead, it had given him time to nurture the dark fantasies that had been growing in his mind since adolescence. Upon his release, he moved into a small house in Ferguson and took a job as a waiter at a local hotel. To his co-workers, he seemed like just another ex-convict trying to get his life back on track. They had no idea that he was methodically transforming his basement into a chamber of horrors, purchasing restraints, video equipment, and soundproofing materials. By the year 2000, everything was ready. Travis began hunting in the most vulnerable corners of St. Louis society. His victims were predominantly women struggling with drug addiction, many working as prostitutes to support their habits. These were women who lived on the margins, whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. He would cruise the streets in his car, offering drugs or money, presenting himself as just another customer. His targets trusted him because he seemed harmless, polite, even gentle in his approach. Once he lured them to his house, their nightmare began. Travis would lead them down to his basement, where the horror of their situation would become apparent. The room was equipped with restraints bolted to the walls and ceiling, video cameras positioned at multiple angles, and an array of implements designed to inflict maximum psychological and physical torment. He didn't simply kill his victims quickly. Instead, he subjected them to prolonged periods of torture, degradation, and terror, all while recording every moment for his own twisted gratification. The videotapes that investigators later discovered provided a chilling glimpse into Travis's methodology. He would force his victims to perform degrading acts while bound and helpless, alternating between mock kindness and brutal violence to maximize their psychological anguish. He seemed to derive as much pleasure from their fear and humiliation as from the physical acts of torture. The recordings showed him speaking to his victims in a calm, almost conversational tone while inflicting unimaginable suffering. Betty James, a 40-year-old woman struggling with drug addiction, was one of the few victims investigators could identify from the videotapes. The footage showed her final hours in excruciating detail, bound and terrorized, while Travis methodically broke down her will to live. Her death, like the others, came through ligature strangulation, but only after hours or sometimes days of torture. Travis would keep some victims alive for extended periods, returning to the basement multiple times to continue their torment. After killing his victims, Travis faced the challenge of disposal. He developed a system for transporting the bodies to remote locations across Missouri and Illinois, scattering them in fields, along riverbanks, and in abandoned areas where they might never be found. Some bodies were discovered months or years later, often too decomposed to provide useful forensic evidence. Others have never been recovered. He claimed in later correspondence to have murdered 17 women though investigators believe the actual number could be even higher. For 2 years, Travis operated with near impunity. The scattered nature of the body dumps made it difficult for different law enforcement agencies to recognize a pattern. The victims' marginalized status meant their disappearances didn't always receive immediate attention. Travis grew increasingly confident, even cocky about his ability to kill without consequences. This hubris would ultimately prove to be his downfall. In May of 2002, Travis made a decision that would expose him to the full force of modern digital forensics. He printed out a map from the internet showing the location of one of his victims' bodies and mailed it anonymously to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper. His motivation was likely a combination of arrogance and a desire for recognition. He wanted law enforcement to find the body and know that someone was playing games with them, staying one step ahead of their investigation. What Travis didn't realize was that internet technology in 2002 left digital fingerprints that could be traced. The map he printed had come from Expedia.com, and the website maintained logs of user activity. When investigators examined the map, they noticed it contained metadata that could be tracked back to its source. Working with Expedia, FBI agents were able to identify the specific computer and internet connection used to access the map. The digital trail led directly to Travis's home address. On June 7, 2002, FBI agents and local police surrounded Travis's house in Ferguson. When they knocked on the door, Travis answered calmly, showing no signs of panic or surprise. He had been expecting this moment, perhaps even looking forward to it. During the initial questioning, he maintained his innocence, claiming he had no knowledge of any murders. But the evidence surrounding him was overwhelming. The search of his house revealed a scene that hardened investigators would later describe as the most disturbing they had ever encountered. The basement torture chamber contained blood spatters on the walls and ceiling, restraints stained with bodily fluids, and a collection of videotapes that documented his crimes in horrifying detail. Investigators also found personal items belonging to several victims, trophies he had kept as reminders of his conquests. During interrogation, Travis remained remarkably composed. He denied direct involvement in the murders, even when confronted with photographic evidence linking him to the victims. His calm demeanor was perhaps the most chilling aspect of his personality. Here was a man who had inflicted unimaginable suffering on dozens of women, yet he showed no signs of remorse, guilt, or even nervousness. He seemed to view the entire situation as an intellectual exercise, a game he was playing with investigators. Travis's case marked a significant milestone in the use of digital forensics to solve serial killer cases. The ability to trace internet activity back to a specific user opened new possibilities for law enforcement, while also highlighting the potential for technology to expose criminals who thought they were operating anonymously. It was one of the first major cases where internet metadata played a crucial role in identifying a serial killer. 3 days after his arrest, on June 10, 2002, guards found Maury Travis dead in his jail cell. He had fashioned a noose from bedsheets and hanged himself, choosing to end his life rather than face trial and the possibility of execution. The note provided no additional details about his crimes or motivations, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Travis's suicide deprived investigators of the opportunity to learn the full scope of his crimes. Without his cooperation, many of his victims may never be identified, and their families may never receive closure. The videotapes provided evidence of additional murders beyond those for which bodies had been found, suggesting that Travis's victim count was higher than the 12 deaths to which he was definitively linked. The psychological profile that emerged from Travis's case painted a picture of a sexual sadist who derived pleasure not just from killing, but from the complete domination and degradation of his victims. Unlike some serial killers who kill quickly in moments of rage or compulsion, Travis was methodical and patient. He savored the process of breaking down his victims psychologically before ending their lives. The videotapes suggested he revisited his recordings repeatedly, reliving the experience of total control over another human being. Gerald Stano presents one of the most controversial cases in the annals of American serial killing, not because of the brutality of his crimes, but because of the sheer volume of his confessions and the questions surrounding their accuracy. Born Paul Zeininger on September 12, 1951, in Schenectady, New York, he was abandoned by his birth mother and placed for adoption at 6 months old. Norma and Eugene Stano adopted him, giving him their name and what they believed would be a loving home. Despite their efforts, Gerald exhibited troubling behaviors from an early age that would foreshadow his violent future. As a child, Stano struggled academically and socially. He was a compulsive liar who engaged in petty theft and had difficulty forming relationships with his peers. At school, he was frequently bullied, which may have contributed to his growing resentment toward others. One particularly disturbing incident occurred when he was 11 or 12 years old and killed a neighbor's baby chicks, an act of animal cruelty that child psychologists often identify as a warning sign for future violent behavior. His adoptive parents, though loving, seemed unable to address the deeper psychological issues that were manifesting in their son. By his late teens, Stano had dropped out of high school and was drifting aimlessly through life. He held a series of menial jobs, but could never maintain steady employment. His social interactions were awkward and strained, particularly with women. He later claimed that his first murder occurred when he was 18 years old, though this, like many of his statements, remains unverified. What is certain is that by his early 20s, he had begun targeting vulnerable women in a killing spree that would span more than a decade. Stano's victims were primarily women living on the margins of society. He targeted prostitutes, hitchhikers, and runaway teenagers, women whose disappearances might not immediately trigger intensive police investigations. His method was deceptively simple. He would approach these women in his car, offering them rides or engaging them in conversation. Once they were in his vehicle, he would drive them to isolated locations where he would kill them using whatever method seemed convenient at the time. Some were stabbed, others were strangled or shot. The randomness of his killing methods suggested that the act of murder itself, rather than any specific ritual, was what drove him. Between 1969 and 1980, Stano claimed to have killed 41 women across Florida, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. He described his victims in chilling detail, explaining how he would select them based on their vulnerability and accessibility. He showed no remorse for his actions, instead speaking about the murders as if they were routine activities. His ability to recall specific details about crimes committed years earlier was both remarkable and disturbing, suggesting that these killings held significant psychological importance for him. The unraveling of Stano's killing spree began in April 1980 when he was arrested for assaulting a prostitute named Donna Hensley in Daytona Beach, Florida. Hensley had managed to escape from Stano's car and provided police with a description that led to his arrest. During questioning about this assault, something unexpected happened. Stano suddenly confessed not only to attacking Hensley, but also to murdering Mary Carol Maher, a young woman whose body had been found several weeks earlier. This initial confession opened the floodgates. Over the following months, Detective Paul Crowe of the Volusia County Sheriff's Office conducted extensive interviews with Stano, during which he confessed to murder after murder. The confessions came in remarkable detail, with Stano describing crime scenes, victim descriptions, and methods of killing that seemed to match unsolved cases across multiple jurisdictions. For investigators dealing with cold cases that had remained unsolved for years, Stano's confessions appeared to be a breakthrough of unprecedented proportions. However, the reliability of these confessions soon became a subject of intense controversy within law enforcement circles. Critics argued that Detective Crowe had spoon-fed details of unsolved homicides to Stano, who would then incorporate these details into his confessions. The concern was that Stano, who had a documented history of compulsive lying and a desire for attention, was simply telling investigators what they wanted to hear rather than providing genuine admissions of guilt. The skepticism surrounding Stano's confessions was not without merit. In many cases, there was little or no physical evidence linking him to the crimes he claimed to have committed. His descriptions of crime scenes and victims often matched information that had been published in newspapers or discussed among law enforcement personnel, raising questions about whether he had genuine knowledge of the crimes or was simply repeating information he had acquired elsewhere. Despite these concerns, investigators found that some of Stano's confessions contained details that had not been made public, suggesting that he did have intimate knowledge of at least some of the murders. The challenge was determining which confessions were genuine and which were fabricated. This task was complicated by Stano's own psychological makeup. He seemed to derive satisfaction from being seen as a prolific killer, and he may have been motivated to exaggerate his criminal history to enhance his notoriety. Of the 41 murders to which Stano confessed, he was only prosecuted for a handful. The cases selected for prosecution were those where investigators felt they had the strongest evidence linking him to the crimes. He was convicted for the murders of Mary Carol Maher, Tony Van Haddock, Nancy Hurd, Susan Bickrest, Mary Kathleen Muldoon, and Kathy Lee Scharf. In most of these cases, he pleaded guilty, accepting life sentences and eventually receiving the death penalty. The controversy surrounding Stano's case reached a crescendo years after his conviction when a posthumous FBI laboratory report surfaced indicating that pubic hairs found on one of his victims, Kathy Lee Scharf, could not have come from Stano. This revelation raised serious questions about the validity of at least one of his convictions and cast further doubt on the reliability of his confessions overall. If he had falsely confessed to or been wrongly convicted of one murder, how many others might be similarly questionable? Despite these doubts, Gerald Stano was executed by electric chair on March 23, 1998, at the age of 46. His execution closed the book on one of the most controversial serial killer cases in American criminal justice history. To his final day, he maintained that his confessions were genuine, though he never provided satisfactory explanations for the inconsistencies and lack of physical evidence that plagued many of his cases. The legacy of Gerald Stano's case extends beyond the question of his guilt or innocence in specific murders. His case highlighted the dangers of relying too heavily on confessions without corroborating physical evidence, particularly when dealing with individuals who may have psychological motivations for false admissions. It also raised important questions about interrogation techniques and the potential for law enforcement officers to inadvertently influence suspect statements. The true number of people Gerald Stano killed may never be known. He may have been responsible for dozens of murders as he claimed, or he may have been a relatively minor criminal who fabricated an extensive murder spree to gain attention and notoriety. Now let's examine the case of Maury Travis, a monster who turned the very technology meant to connect us into an instrument of unimaginable horror. In the early 2000s, as the internet was becoming a fixture in American homes, Travis was using it not just to hunt for victims, but to document and distribute his most depraved acts. His story serves as a chilling reminder that evil adapts to every era, finding new ways to inflict suffering and evade justice. Maury Troy Travis was born on October 25, 1965, in St. Louis, Missouri, into what appeared to be an ordinary working-class family. His childhood was unremarkable in all the ways that make his later crimes so disturbing. There were no obvious signs of the monster he would become. He attended local schools, lived with his mother, and seemed to blend into the background of suburban life. But beneath this facade of normalcy, something dark was taking root. Travis was described by those who knew him as withdrawn and socially awkward, preferring to spend time alone rather than with friends or family. As a young adult, Travis struggled to find his place in the world. He worked various jobs, including as a hotel waiter, but never seemed to establish lasting relationships or meaningful connections with others. He had a history of drug use, particularly crack cocaine, which began to consume more and more of his life. In 1989, his descent into criminality became official when he was convicted of armed robbery and sentenced to prison. During his incarceration, rather than reflecting on his actions or seeking rehabilitation, Travis seemed to retreat further into himself, nursing fantasies that would later manifest in the most horrific ways imaginable. After his release on parole, Travis returned to St. Louis and moved into a modest home in Ferguson, Missouri. To neighbors and casual acquaintances, he appeared to be trying to rebuild his life. He found work and kept to himself, rarely causing trouble or drawing attention. But inside his home, Travis was constructing something that would later be described by investigators as one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever encountered. In his basement, he meticulously created what can only be called a torture chamber, complete with restraints, soundproofing, and most chillingly, video recording equipment. The technology that was revolutionizing communication and entertainment became Travis's tool for documenting depravity. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to preserve every moment of his victims' suffering, to relive their terror and his sense of absolute power over them. The basement chamber was designed not just for murder, but for prolonged psychological and physical torture. He installed cameras at multiple angles, ensuring that every detail of his crimes would be captured for his later viewing pleasure. Travis's victims were primarily women involved in prostitution, many of whom were struggling with drug addiction. He understood that these women were vulnerable, often estranged from family and friends, and less likely to be immediately missed if they disappeared. He would cruise the streets of St. Louis, particularly areas known for drug activity and sex work, looking for potential victims. His approach was calculated and predatory. He would present himself as just another customer, someone seeking their services, but once he had lured them to his home, their nightmare would begin. The details of what occurred in Travis's basement are almost too horrific to comprehend. The videotapes recovered by police showed scenes of such extreme cruelty that many investigators required psychological counseling after viewing them. Travis would restrain his victims and subject them to hours of torture, both physical and psychological. He seemed to derive particular pleasure from their fear and desperation, often taunting them and forcing them to beg for their lives. The recordings captured not just the physical violence, but Travis's own voice, calm and methodical as he inflicted unimaginable suffering. Between 2000 and 2002, Travis murdered at least 12 women, though he himself claimed the number was higher. In a letter he would later write, he boasted of killing 17 victims, and investigators suspected the true count might have been even greater. Each murder followed a similar pattern: abduction, transport to his home, prolonged torture in the basement chamber, and finally death by strangulation. He would then dispose of the bodies in remote locations throughout Missouri and Illinois, scattering them across multiple jurisdictions to make it more difficult for law enforcement to connect the cases. What makes Travis's story particularly chilling is how he managed to maintain his facade of normalcy while committing these atrocities. He continued to work, paid his bills, and interacted with neighbors as if he were just another resident of Ferguson. The compartmentalization required to live such a double life speaks to a level of psychological dysfunction that defies understanding. He wasn't driven by rage or passion, but by a cold, calculating desire to inflict suffering for his own gratification. Travis's downfall came through his own arrogance and desire for recognition. In May 2002, he made a decision that would ultimately lead to his capture. He anonymously mailed a hand-drawn map to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper, marking the location where he had dumped the body of one of his victims. The map was accompanied by a taunting note, suggesting that Travis wanted credit for his crimes and enjoyed the idea of leading police to evidence of his work. What Travis didn't anticipate was how quickly technology could be used to trace his identity. This was still relatively early in the widespread use of internet mapping tools, and the technology for tracking such digital footprints was just beginning to be developed. FBI computer specialists were able to trace the map back to the specific computer and internet connection used to access and print it. The digital trail led directly to Travis's home computer. This represented one of the first major cases where internet forensics played a crucial role in identifying a serial killer. The investigation marked a turning point in how law enforcement approached crimes involving digital evidence, establishing protocols and techniques that would become standard in later investigations. On June 7, 2002, police arrested Travis at his home. During the search, they discovered the full extent of his crimes: the basement torture chamber, the video equipment, the restraints, and most damning of all, the collection of videotapes documenting his murders. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Blood evidence throughout the house, personal belongings of victims, and the recorded confessions of Travis himself as he committed his crimes. During interrogation, Travis initially denied involvement in the murders, despite being confronted with the physical evidence found in his home. He seemed almost surprised that he had been caught, as if he believed his careful planning and disposal methods would protect him indefinitely. The videos were so disturbing that prosecutors were hesitant to use them in court, knowing the psychological impact they would have on jurors. But Travis would never face trial for his crimes. On June 10, 2002, just 3 days after his arrest, he was found dead in his jail cell. He had hanged himself using bed sheets, leaving behind a brief suicide note addressed to his mother. It was the closest thing to an explanation he ever provided for his actions, though it offered little insight into what had driven him to commit such horrific crimes. Travis's suicide robbed investigators and victims' families of the opportunity to fully understand the scope of his crimes. Questions remained about additional victims, about the timeline of his killing spree, and about what had triggered his descent into such extreme violence. The videotapes provided irrefutable evidence of his guilt, but they also raised disturbing questions about how someone could become so completely consumed by the desire to inflict suffering. The case had a profound impact on law enforcement's approach to internet-related crimes. It demonstrated both the potential for technology to aid criminals in their activities and its power as a tool for investigation and prosecution. The techniques developed during the Travis investigation would later be used in countless other cases, helping to solve crimes that might otherwise have remained unsolved. For the families of Travis's victims, his suicide meant that many questions would never be answered. The women he murdered were daughters, mothers, and sisters, and while they may have been involved in dangerous lifestyles, they didn't deserve the fate that Travis inflicted upon them. His crimes highlighted the vulnerability of society's most marginalized members and the importance of treating all victims with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. The Maury Travis case stands as a stark reminder that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary facades. His ability to compartmentalize his crimes while maintaining a seemingly normal life demonstrates the terrifying reality that monsters don't always look like monsters. They can be neighbors, co-workers, or casual acquaintances who reveal their true nature only when it's too late for their victims to escape. Travis's use of technology to document and facilitate his crimes also foreshadowed a new era of criminal behavior. As the internet became more prevalent and sophisticated, other criminals would follow similar patterns, using digital tools to hunt for victims, share their crimes, or evade detection. The Travis case became a crucial learning experience for law enforcement agencies worldwide, helping them develop the skills and techniques necessary to combat this evolving threat. The 12 confirmed victims of Maury Travis represent just a fraction of the lives destroyed by serial killers who operate in the shadows of society. Their names may not be widely remembered, but their suffering serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, investigation, and justice. The patterns that emerge when studying these five killers reveal disturbing truths about the evolution of evil in modern society. Each represents a different pathway to darkness, yet they share common threads that help us understand the nature of predatory behavior and the masks that monsters wear. Belle Gunness demonstrated that evil has always been capable of adaptation and innovation. Operating in the early 1900s, she understood the power of deception and manipulation long before psychology had formal names for these behaviors. Her Lonely Hearts advertisements were an early form of what we now recognize as catfishing, proving that predators have always found ways to exploit human vulnerability and desire for connection. What made Gunness particularly chilling was her ability to compartmentalize her crimes while maintaining relationships with neighbors and her own children. She attended church, participated in community events, and presented herself as a hardworking widow, all while systematically murdering dozens of people on her property. The financial motivation behind her crimes reveals another disturbing pattern. Gunness wasn't driven by sexual sadism or psychological compulsion in the traditional sense. Instead, she treated murder as a business transaction, coldly calculating the most efficient ways to acquire wealth through death. This mercenary approach to killing demonstrates how some individuals can completely dehumanize others, viewing victims not as people, but as resources to be harvested. Her meticulous planning, from the placement of advertisements to the disposal of bodies, shows a level of organizational skill that allowed her to operate undetected for years. Richard Cottingham represents the terrifying reality of the compartmentalized killer, the family man who transforms into a monster. His case illustrates how evil can flourish in plain sight, hidden behind the facade of suburban normalcy. Cottingham's ability to maintain his job at Blue Cross Blue Shield, raise 3 children, and participate in community life while simultaneously torturing and murdering women reveals the frightening capacity some individuals have for leading double lives. His crimes escalated in brutality over time, from his early victims who were innocent teenagers and housewives to later targeting sex workers, showing how serial killers often refine their methods and victim selection to reduce their risk of capture. The psychological profile that emerges from Cottingham's case is particularly disturbing. His need to remove identifying features from victims, decapitating and removing hands, speaks to a desire not just to kill, but to completely erase the humanity of his victims. The fire-setting behavior that earned him the nickname Torso Killer demonstrates an additional layer of sadism as he sought to destroy evidence while also creating a spectacular crime scene. His later confessions to investigators, delivered with apparent pride and detailed recollection, reveal the narcissistic component that drives many serial killers to eventually seek recognition for their crimes. Manuel Moore and the Death Angels represent organized evil driven by ideology and racial hatred. Their case demonstrates how extremist beliefs can provide justification and structure for mass murder, transforming individual psychological disturbance into coordinated terrorism. The systematic nature of their crimes, with specific targeting criteria and apparent quotas or goals, shows how hate can be weaponized and institutionalized within small groups. The fact that they called themselves death angels and viewed their murders as religious or political acts reveals the dangerous intersection of mental illness, extremist ideology, and group dynamics. The random selection of victims based solely on race created widespread terror in San Francisco, demonstrating how serial killing can be used as a tool of social disruption. Unlike other serial killers who may target specific types of individuals based on personal pathology, Moore and his associates were attempting to destabilize society itself. Their crimes represent a form of domestic terrorism that predated many of the ideologically motivated attacks we see today, showing how small groups of radicalized individuals can hold entire communities hostage through coordinated violence. Maury Travis embodies the evolution of serial killing in the digital age, representing how technology has both enabled new forms of predation and provided new tools for law enforcement. His use of the internet to research victims, taunt authorities, and ultimately his downfall through digital forensics marks a turning point in criminal investigation. Travis's creation of a torture chamber in his basement, complete with video recording equipment, reveals the intersection of sadism and narcissism that drives many modern killers. His need to document his crimes speaks to a desire for immortality through horror, wanting his acts to be remembered and studied. The videotapes recovered from Travis's home provide perhaps the most direct window into the mind of a serial killer that investigators have ever obtained. Unlike cases where we must reconstruct the killer's psychology from crime scenes and victim accounts, Travis literally filmed himself in the act of torture and murder. This documentation reveals the calculated nature of his sadism, the way he savored his victims' fear and pain, and the complete absence of empathy that characterized his interactions with human beings he viewed as objects for his entertainment. Gerald Stano's case highlights the complex relationship between confession, truth, and justice in serial killer investigations. His willingness to confess to dozens of murders raises fundamental questions about the reliability of such admissions and the potential for false confessions in high-profile cases. The controversy surrounding his confessions demonstrates how the desire to solve cold cases can sometimes lead investigators to accept questionable evidence, potentially resulting in wrongful convictions or allowing actual perpetrators to escape justice. The sheer volume of Stano's claimed victims, if accurate, would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. However, the lack of physical evidence linking him to many of these crimes creates a troubling ambiguity. His case serves as a cautionary tale about the limitations of confession-based prosecutions and the importance of corroborating evidence in death penalty cases. The posthumous DNA evidence that excluded him from at least one murder raises the disturbing possibility that other confessions may have been false, either due to coercion, mental illness, or a desire for notoriety. What unites all 5 of these killers is their ability to exploit the trust and vulnerability of others. Belle Gunness preyed on lonely immigrants seeking companionship. Richard Cottingham targeted women who were simply going about their daily lives or were already marginalized by society. Manuel Moore and the Death Angels attacked random individuals based on nothing more than skin color. Maury Travis focused on women struggling with addiction and poverty. Gerald Stano claimed to target hitchhikers and runaways. In each case, The killers identified people who were isolated, desperate, or simply unlucky enough to cross their paths. These cases also reveal how societal changes have influenced the methods and opportunities available to serial killers. Belle Gunness operated in an era of limited communication and record keeping, allowing her to repeatedly collect insurance money and dispose of bodies without immediate detection. The Death Angels took advantage of urban anonymity and racial tensions to create maximum terror. Richard Cottingham exploited the anonymity of motels and the vulnerability of sex workers. Maury Travis used internet technology to research and stalk victims while also creating digital evidence that ultimately led to his capture. Each killer adapted to the opportunities and limitations of their time period. The investigation and prosecution of these cases also demonstrate the evolution of law enforcement techniques. Belle Gunness operated largely before modern forensic science, relying primarily on witness testimony and physical evidence that could be easily destroyed. The Death Angels case was solved through informant testimony and traditional detective work. Richard Cottingham was initially caught through conventional police work, but later linked to additional crimes through DNA analysis. Maury Travis was captured through early digital forensics. Gerald Stano's case relied heavily on confession, with later DNA analysis calling some convictions into question. Perhaps most disturbing is what these cases reveal about the potential scope of undetected serial killing. Belle Gunness may have escaped justice entirely, potentially living out her life under a new identity. Richard Cottingham claims to have killed far more people than he's been convicted of murdering. The Death Angels may have been responsible for dozens of additional deaths. Maury Travis took the full extent of his crimes to the grave. Gerald Stano's true victim count remains unknown and disputed. In each case, the confirmed victims likely represent only a fraction of the actual death toll. These 5 killers remind us that evil rarely announces itself with obvious warning signs. Instead, it often hides behind masks of respectability, normalcy, or even victimhood. They operated in different eras, used different methods, and had different motivations, yet they all shared the fundamental characteristic that defines the serial killer: the ability to repeatedly take human life without remorse or empathy. Their stories serve as both historical record and ongoing warning, documenting the darkest capabilities of human nature while highlighting the constant need for vigilance in protecting society's most vulnerable members. The legacy of these cases extends beyond their immediate victims to encompass the families left behind, the communities terrorized, and the investigators who dedicated years to seeking justice. The psychology behind these killers reveals disturbing patterns that extend far beyond individual pathology. What makes their crimes particularly chilling isn't just their brutality, but how they exploited the very systems designed to protect society. Each killer represents a different facet of evil, adapted to their time and circumstances, yet all sharing a fundamental disregard for human life that defies comprehension. Belle Gunness understood that America's frontier spirit and immigrant communities created perfect hunting grounds. Her Lonely Hearts advertisements weren't just deceptive marketing, they were psychological warfare against men desperate for companionship. She weaponized hope itself, turning the American dream into a nightmare. The fact that she likely escaped justice after staging her own death demonstrates a level of cunning that rivals fictional villains. Her case reveals how isolation and desperation can be exploited by those who understand human vulnerability. Richard Cottingham's suburban facade represents perhaps the most terrifying aspect of serial killing, the monster next door. His ability to compartmentalize his life, maintaining a job, marriage, and family while committing unspeakable acts of torture and murder challenges our fundamental assumptions about evil. The contrast between his daytime persona as a computer operator and his nighttime activities as a sadistic killer illustrates how predators can hide in plain sight. His methodical approach, particularly his use of fire to destroy evidence and his targeting of society's most vulnerable, shows a calculated intelligence that made him extraordinarily dangerous. The Death Angels, including Manuel Moore, represent organized evil with ideological justification. Their crimes weren't random acts of violence, but systematic terrorism designed to ignite racial conflict. This transforms individual pathology into group dynamics, where shared hatred amplifies individual capacity for violence. The fact that they operated as a coordinated unit with specific targeting criteria and operational procedures demonstrates how extremist ideology can create killing machines. Their case illustrates how hate groups can transform disturbed individuals into instruments of terror. Maury Travis embodied evil in the digital age, using technology not just to commit crimes, but to document and potentially distribute them. His basement torture chamber, complete with video equipment, represents a new evolution in serial killing where the act of recording becomes part of the gratification. The irony that his technological savvy both enabled his crimes and led to his capture through internet forensics shows how the same tools that expand criminal possibilities also create new investigative opportunities. His case marked a turning point in how law enforcement approaches digital evidence in serial killer investigations. Gerald Stano's case presents the most complex psychological puzzle where the line between truth and fabrication becomes impossibly blurred. His compulsive confessing raises fundamental questions about the nature of criminal responsibility and the reliability of admissions. Whether he was a prolific killer seeking attention or a disturbed individual manipulated by investigators, his case exposes flaws in how the justice system handles confessions. The controversy surrounding his convictions demonstrates how the desire to solve cases can sometimes compromise the pursuit of truth. What unites these killers isn't just their capacity for violence, but their ability to identify and exploit societal weaknesses. Gunness exploited social isolation and economic desperation. Cottingham exploited trust and normalcy. The Death Angels exploited racial tensions and religious extremism. Travis exploited technological advancement and sexual commerce. Stano exploited the investigative process itself. Each found cracks in the social fabric and widened them into chasms of horror. Their methods evolved with their times, but their fundamental motivation remained constant: the desire for absolute power over other human beings. This isn't simply mental illness or social dysfunction, but something more profound and disturbing. They represent the capacity for evil that exists within human nature, unleashed when moral constraints fail and opportunity presents itself. The investigation and prosecution of these killers also reveals how law enforcement has had to evolve. From Belle Gunness's era, when forensic science was primitive and communication between jurisdictions was limited, to the digital forensics that caught Maury Travis, each case pushed investigative techniques forward. The controversy surrounding Gerald Stano's confessions led to reforms in interrogation procedures and confession validation. Perhaps most disturbing is how these killers maintained their activities for extended periods. Gunness operated for years, Cottingham for over a decade. The Death Angels terrorized San Francisco for months, Travis killed for years, and Stano's spree lasted over a decade. This persistence suggests not just individual failure, but systemic vulnerabilities that allowed them to continue. Their victims, predominantly society's most vulnerable members, women, minorities, sex workers, hitchhikers, and the economically disadvantaged, highlight how predators instinctively target those least likely to be missed or believed. This pattern reveals uncomfortable truths about whose lives society values and protects. The geographic spread of their crimes, from Belle Gunness's Indiana farm to Cottingham's New York and New Jersey territory, from San Francisco's zebra murders to Travis's St. Louis area killings and Stano's multi-state rampage, demonstrates how mobility can enable serial killing. Modern transportation networks that connect communities also create opportunities for predators to hunt across jurisdictions. These cases collectively represent more than individual criminal acts. They're windows into the darker aspects of American society across different eras. They show how evil adapts and evolves, finding new methods and opportunities while maintaining its fundamental character. Understanding these killers isn't about sympathizing with them, but about recognizing the conditions that enable such monsters to emerge and operate. The legacy of these unknown killers serves as a reminder that evil often wears ordinary faces and operates in familiar spaces. Their stories compel us to remain vigilant, to protect the vulnerable, and to never assume that monsters announce themselves. Each of these 5 cases forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of evil itself. These killers didn't emerge from some dark corner of society wearing masks and warning signs. They walked among us, often for decades, hiding their monstrous appetites behind carefully constructed facades of normalcy, vulnerability, or even righteousness. Belle Gunness mastered the art of deception long before modern psychology understood the predatory nature of such manipulation. She weaponized society's expectations of women as nurturing and vulnerable, transforming her gender into the perfect camouflage for industrial-scale murder. Her Lonely Hearts advertisements weren't just scams, they were hunting licenses. She understood that desperate men seeking companionship would lower their guard, bring their life savings, and tell no one where they were going. Her farm became a factory of death, where human beings were processed like livestock, their bodies fed to pigs, their identities erased from existence. The most chilling aspect isn't just the scale of her crimes, but the cold business efficiency with which she conducted them. Murder wasn't passion for Belle, it was simply the most profitable form of commerce she could devise. Richard Cottingham represents perhaps the most terrifying archetype of all, the suburban family man whose basement conceals hell itself. For over a decade, he maintained 2 completely separate existences. By day, he was the reliable computer operator, the devoted husband, the caring father who attended school plays and neighborhood barbecues. By night, he prowled the streets of New York and New Jersey, selecting victims with the methodical precision of a hunting predator. His ability to compartmentalize these two lives speaks to a level of psychological sophistication that defies comprehension. The women he tortured and dismembered weren't human beings to him. They were objects for his amusement, puzzles to be solved through pain and degradation. When investigators finally cornered him, they discovered that his apparent normalcy wasn't a mask he wore, it was simply another tool in his arsenal of manipulation. The Death Angels, including Manuel Moore, transformed ideology into a weapon of mass destruction. They didn't kill for money, passion, or personal gratification. They killed for a cause, which made them infinitely more dangerous than any individual psychopath. Their victims were selected not for who they were, but for what they represented in the killer's twisted worldview. Every random white person walking down a San Francisco street became a potential target in their self-declared race war. The systematic nature of their murders, the ritualistic elements, the way they celebrated each killing as a victory in their holy war, reveals how easily human beings can be convinced to commit unspeakable acts when those acts are wrapped in the language of righteousness and purpose. They believed they were soldiers in a cosmic battle, when in reality they were simply murderers who had found a way to feel good about their crimes. Maury Travis represents the evolution of evil in the digital age, where previous generations of killers had to rely on luck and opportunity. Travis used technology to become a more efficient predator. He didn't just kill his victims, he archived their suffering, creating a library of human agony that he could revisit whenever he chose. His basement torture chamber wasn't just a killing room, it was a production studio where he directed, filmed, and edited the final moments of human lives. The videotapes police discovered weren't evidence of crimes, they were trophies, souvenirs of his power over life and death. His eventual capture through internet tracking marked a new chapter in law enforcement, but it also revealed how technology had given killers new tools for stalking, tormenting, and documenting their victims. Travis understood that in the information age, the ability to remain anonymous while accessing detailed information about potential victims was the ultimate predatory advantage. Gerald Stano presents perhaps the most psychologically complex case of all, a killer whose confessions may have been as manufactured as they were numerous. His relationship with Detective Paul Crowe became a twisted collaboration, with Stano seemingly addicted to the attention and importance that came with each new confession, while Crowe desperately sought to close unsolved cases. The question of whether Stano actually committed all the murders he claimed, or whether he was simply a mentally unstable individual who found purpose in taking credit for other people's crimes, illustrates how the justice system can sometimes create the very monsters it seeks to catch. His case forces us to confront the possibility that our desire to find answers, to assign blame, to close cases and move on, can sometimes lead us to accept convenient lies rather than pursue uncomfortable truths. What connects all these cases isn't just the violence or the body counts, but the way each killer exploited fundamental weaknesses in the social fabric. Belle Gunness preyed on loneliness and the immigrant experience. Richard Cottingham exploited society's trust in suburban respectability. The Death Angels weaponized racial tension and religious extremism. Maury Travis used technology and urban anonymity. Gerald Stano manipulated the justice system's need for closure. Each found a different crack in civilization's foundation and used it to commit unspeakable acts. These cases also reveal how serial killing has evolved with society itself. Belle Gunness operated in an era when people could disappear without extensive paper trails, when communication was slow and law enforcement was local. Richard Cottingham thrived in the anonymous urban landscape of the 1970s, when forensic science was primitive and jurisdictional boundaries protected killers. The Death Angels exploited the social upheaval of their era, using legitimate grievances to justify illegitimate violence. Maury Travis pioneered the use of internet technology for predatory purposes. Gerald Stano's case reflects the modern era's obsession with psychological profiling and the media's hunger for sensational confessions. Perhaps most disturbing is how these killers were able to operate for so long without detection. Belle Gunness murdered for over 2 decades. Richard Cottingham's spree lasted 13 years. The Death Angels terrorized San Francisco for months. Maury Travis killed for at least 2 years. Gerald Stano claimed an 11-year murder spree. Their longevity wasn't just luck. It was the result of careful planning, social camouflage, and society's reluctance to believe that such evil could exist in plain sight. The legacy of these cases extends far beyond their immediate victims. They changed how we investigate crimes, how we understand criminal psychology, and how we protect potential victims. Belle Gunness's case led to better tracking of insurance claims and missing persons. Richard Cottingham's crimes helped develop modern forensic techniques and multi-jurisdictional cooperation. The Death Angels case highlighted the dangers of extremist ideologies and the need for better intelligence sharing. Maury Travis's capture pioneered digital forensics. Gerald Stano's confessions sparked debates about interrogation techniques and false confessions that continue today. These 5 killers represent different faces of the same fundamental evil: the willingness to treat other human beings as objects to be used, manipulated, and discarded. They remind us that monsters are real, that they walk among us, and that eternal vigilance is the price of civilization. They also demonstrate that evil is not some abstract force, but a very human choice made by individuals who decided that their desires were more important than other people's lives. The most sobering lesson from these cases is that there are undoubtedly others like them operating right now, perfecting their methods, selecting their victims, and hiding behind masks of normalcy, ideology, or technological sophistication. As we reach the end of this dark journey through the minds and methods of these 5 forgotten monsters, we're left with uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil itself. Each of these killers represents a different facet of humanity's capacity for horror, yet they share common threads that reveal disturbing patterns about how predators operate in our society. Belle Gunness showed us that evil can wear the mask of respectability, using society's expectations and vulnerabilities to her advantage. In an era when widowed women were seen as helpless and in need of protection, she weaponized that perception, turning loneliness and hope into tools of murder. Her methodical approach to killing for profit demonstrates how some individuals can completely compartmentalize their humanity, treating other human beings as nothing more than sources of income. The fact that she likely escaped justice, possibly living out her days under a new identity, serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most calculating killers are never truly caught. Richard Cottingham's double life as the respectable family man and sadistic torturer reveals how evil can hide in plain sight, even among those we trust most. His ability to maintain a normal facade while committing acts of unimaginable brutality speaks to a level of psychological compartmentalization that defies comprehension. The sheer longevity of his killing spree, spanning over a decade, demonstrates how serial predators can adapt and evolve their methods to avoid detection. His recent confessions, decades after his initial capture, show that these monsters often take their darkest secrets to the grave, leaving families without closure and investigators without answers. The Death Angels and Manuel Moore represent perhaps the most disturbing category of killer, those driven by ideology and hate. Their systematic targeting of victims based solely on race reveals how twisted beliefs can transform ordinary individuals into instruments of terror. The organized nature of their crimes, operating as a group with shared goals and methods, shows how evil can become institutionalized and ritualized. The fact that they believed their murders served a higher purpose makes their crimes even more chilling, as it demonstrates how ideology can completely override basic human empathy and moral reasoning. Maury Travis embodied the evolution of evil in the digital age, becoming one of the first serial killers to be caught through internet forensics. His creation of a torture chamber and his compulsive need to document his crimes reveal a narcissistic desire not just to kill, but to preserve and potentially share his acts of violence. His use of technology to both facilitate his crimes and ultimately expose himself shows how modern tools can be weapons in the hands of predators, but also powerful instruments of justice. His suicide before trial robbed his victims' families of answers and left investigators with haunting questions about the full scope of his crimes. Gerald Stano's case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our justice system itself. His prolific confessions, whether entirely truthful or partially fabricated, highlight how the desire to solve cases can sometimes compromise the pursuit of truth. The controversy surrounding his admissions reveals the complex psychology of serial killers who seek attention and notoriety, even in custody. His case demonstrates how the line between solving crimes and creating false narratives can become dangerously blurred when investigators are desperate for answers and killers are desperate for recognition. What makes these cases particularly disturbing is not just the brutality of the crimes, but how each killer exploited specific vulnerabilities in society. Belle Gunness preyed on loneliness and the immigrant experience. Cottingham used the anonymity of urban life and the marginalization of sex workers. The Death Angels exploited racial tensions and the chaos of the 1970s. Travis took advantage of drug addiction and the early days of internet anonymity. Stano manipulated the justice system's desire for closure and confession. These patterns reveal uncomfortable truths about how serial killers operate. They don't just kill randomly, they study society's weak points and exploit them ruthlessly. They target victims who are less likely to be missed quickly, marginalized individuals whose disappearances might not trigger immediate, intensive investigations. They adapt to available technology and social conditions, constantly evolving their methods to stay ahead of law enforcement. Perhaps most disturbing is how normal these killers appeared to those around them. Belle Gunness was seen as a hard-working widow. Cottingham was a devoted family man and reliable employees. The Death Angels were part of a religious community. Travis was just another quiet neighbor. Stano seemed like a harmless, if troubled, young man. This normalcy is not coincidental. It's camouflage, carefully maintained to allow their true nature to operate undetected. The investigations that eventually brought these killers to justice also reveal how law enforcement techniques have evolved over the decades. From the primitive forensic methods available during Belle Gunness's era to the digital forensics that caught Maury Travis, each case pushed investigative boundaries and contributed to advances in criminal detection. DNA evidence helped convict Cottingham decades after his crimes. Witness testimony and community pressure solved the zebra murders. Psychological profiling and interrogation techniques were tested in the Stano case. Yet for all our advances in criminal investigation, these cases remind us that evil persists and adapts. Today's serial killers are undoubtedly learning from the mistakes of those who came before, finding new ways to exploit technology, social media, and modern life's anonymity. The dark web, encrypted communications, and global mobility present new challenges for law enforcement that these historical cases could never have anticipated. The victims of these crimes represent more than statistics. They were individuals with hopes, dreams, families, and futures that were brutally cut short. The immigrant men who traveled to Belle Gunness's farm seeking love and companionship. The young women whose lives were stolen by Cottingham's sadistic urges. The random pedestrians gunned down by the Death Angels simply for their race. The vulnerable women tortured and killed by Travis. The hitchhikers and runaways who became Stano's victims. Each name represents a life lost, a family destroyed, a community traumatized. These forgotten monsters remind us that evil is not always dramatic or obvious. It doesn't always announce itself with manifestos or grand gestures. Sometimes it operates quietly, methodically, hiding behind ordinary faces and mundane routines. It exploits our basic human needs for connection, our trust in others, our willingness to help strangers. It takes advantage of society's blind spots and our reluctance to believe that such horror can exist among us. The legacy of these killers extends beyond their individual crimes. They changed how we investigate serial murder, influenced our understanding of criminal psychology, and forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about the monsters that walk among us. Their cases contributed to advances in forensic science, criminal profiling, and victim advocacy. They reminded us that justice sometimes comes slowly, but it can come nonetheless. As we close this examination of forgotten evil, we're left with the sobering knowledge that there are undoubtedly other monsters operating right now in our communities, using methods we haven't yet learned to detect. The most terrifying aspect of these cases isn't just what these killers did, but the certainty that others like them are out there, studying, planning, and waiting for their opportunities. The fight against such evil requires constant vigilance, continued advancement in investigative techniques, and a willingness to believe victims and take threats seriously. It requires us to protect the vulnerable, to notice when people disappear, and to remember that behind every missing person poster is someone who mattered to somebody. Most importantly, it requires us to never forget that evil, no matter how well it hides, leaves traces, and with enough persistence, dedication, and advancement in our methods, it can be found and stopped. These 5 forgotten monsters may have thought they could kill with impunity, disappearing into history as unnamed shadows. Instead, their crimes serve as stark reminders of humanity's capacity for both ultimate evil and ultimate justice. Their victims will be remembered not just as statistics in criminal files, but as human beings whose lives had value and whose deaths demanded justice. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that even the most forgotten monsters cannot escape the light of truth forever.